The scream tore through the station before I even opened my eyes. It was not a cry. It was not a whimper. It was a sound that seemed to come from somewhere ancient, somewhere raw. A sound that made the metal walls of Velkatha Station hum with a strange, sick vibration. I sat up in my bunk, heart hammering, and reached for the nearest wall panel to check the alert feed. Red lights blinked across every corridor. My translator earpiece buzzed with a warning in 3 different alien tongues before it finally settled into words I could understand. Medical emergency, royal quarters. All non-essential personnel remain confined to quarters. I was Ellen Marsh, and I was the only human on board a Confederation diplomatic vessel filled with species that barely tolerated my presence. For 6 months I had been assigned as a cultural liaison, a title that sounded important but meant almost nothing in practice. Most days I ate alone, worked alone, and slept through the quiet hum of engines that carried me farther and farther from home. But that night, sleep was impossible. The screaming did not stop. It went on for hours, then for a full day, then for days after that. I heard whispers in the corridors, quick and nervous exchanges between crew members from species I had never even heard of before boarding this ship. The words that kept repeating, no matter the language, were always the same. The prince will not eat. I learned the details slowly, piecing them together from overheard conversations and cautious questions to anyone willing to answer a human. The Ilthar were one of the oldest and most respected species in the Confederation, a race of great reptilian beings, tall and proud, with scales that shimmered like polished stone and eyes that held centuries of memory even in their youngest members. Their royal line was sacred to them, protected by law, tradition, and something that went far deeper than either. And their newest hatchling, the heir to the Ilthar throne, had been born 3 weeks earlier aboard this very station during a diplomatic transfer. The hatchling would not eat. He would not sleep. He simply screamed, hour after hour, refusing everything placed before him. Physicians had been called in from 6 different systems, specialists in draconic biology, experts in royal nutrition, healers trained in ancient Ilthar medicine. All of them had tried, and all of them had failed. The prince continued to scream, and with every passing day, the fear on the ship grew heavier, like a fog that seeped into every corridor and every conversation. I was not supposed to care. It was not my department, not my species, not my problem. But something about that sound kept pulling at me. Maybe it was because I had once worked in a children's hospital back on Earth, long before I ever thought about joining a Confederation vessel. Maybe it was simply because the sound of a suffering child, of any species, is not something a person can easily ignore. On the 4th day, I made a decision that would have gotten me removed from the ship if it had gone wrong. I gathered a small pot, a portable heater, and the last remaining ingredients from a package my mother had sent months earlier. Ingredients I had been saving because they reminded me of home. Chicken, broth cubes, a handful of vegetables, and spices that had traveled farther than any of them were ever meant to. I made soup, simple and warm, the same recipe my mother used to make whenever I was sick as a child. Then I carried it through the corridors toward the Royal Medical Wing, ignoring the tightening feeling in my chest that told me this was a very bad idea. The guards at the entrance to the royal quarters were Ilthar warriors, easily twice my height, their scales dark and armored, their eyes sharp with suspicion the moment they saw me approaching. One of them, a broad-shouldered guard named Vorin, stepped forward and blocked my path with an arm the size of my entire body. "What is your purpose here?" he asked, his translated voice flat and cold. I held up the pot carefully. "I think I can help," I said. "I heard the prince will not eat. I have something that might work." Vorin looked at the pot with open disgust. "Organic contamination protocols forbid outside substances near royal younglings," he said. "Leave immediately." Before I could respond, another voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. A tall Ilthar woman stepped out from the medical wing, her scales a deep shade of green, her posture radiating authority even through her obvious exhaustion. This was Kalith, the royal physician assigned to the prince, and even from a distance I could see the desperation hidden behind her calm exterior. "Let her through," Kalith said, her voice tired but firm. "Nothing else has worked. What harm could one human do that has not already been done by our own failures?" Vorin hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but stepped aside. I walked past him into the medical wing, my hands trembling slightly around the warm pot, and the sound of the screaming grew louder with every step. It was the kind of sound that made your bones ache, a cry so raw and desperate that it seemed to fill every inch of the room. The nursery chamber was sterile and cold, filled with monitoring equipment and screens displaying numbers I could not understand. In the center of the room, on a raised platform surrounded by soft cushions, lay the hatchling. He was smaller than I expected, barely the size of a large dog, with scales that had not yet hardened into the deep colors of adulthood. His eyes were wide and wet, his small body trembling with each scream, and around him lay dozens of untouched offerings, trays of what looked like mineral supplements, cold metallic-looking substances, and strange crystalline structures that I assumed were meant to be food. Kalith gestured toward the hatchling. "We have tried everything our records suggest," she said. "Mineral compounds matching adult royal diet, temperature-regulated formulas, sedatives strong enough to calm a full-grown warrior. Nothing works. He simply screams and refuses." I looked at the trays again, then at the small, trembling creature in front of me, and something clicked in my mind. All of these offerings looked designed for an adult, cold and clinical. Nothing warm, nothing comforting, nothing that felt like it was made with care rather than calculation. "Can I try something?" I asked. Kalith looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, too exhausted to argue further. I knelt down carefully, keeping my movements slow and steady, the same way I used to approach frightened children back at the hospital. I set the pot down and let the steam rise gently into the air, filling the sterile room with the warm scent of broth and vegetables. The hatchling screaming faltered for just a moment, his wide eyes turning toward the unfamiliar smell. I began to speak softly, not in any official language, just quiet words meant to soothe rather than instruct. "It is okay," I whispered. "I know you are scared. I know everything here feels cold and strange. This will not hurt you, I promise." The prince stared at me, his small chest heaving with exhaustion, and for the first time in 4 days, the screaming stopped completely. The silence in the room was almost as startling as the screaming had been. Kalith took a sharp breath beside me, and I could hear Vorin shifting uncomfortably near the doorway. I dipped a small spoon into the warm broth and held it out slowly, letting the hatchling see it, smell it, decide for himself whether he wanted to trust me. He lunged forward suddenly, faster than I expected, and swallowed the offering eagerly. Then another, and another, his small claws gripping the edge of the pot as he ate with a desperation that told me clearly just how hungry he truly was. Within minutes, the pot was empty, and the prince curled up contentedly among the cushions, his trembling finally subsiding into something like peaceful exhaustion. Kalith stared at the empty pot in stunned silence. "How?" she finally asked. "We tried everything within our medical records. How did something so simple succeed where advanced science failed?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Maybe he was not sick," I said. "Maybe he was just scared and cold and lonely, and nothing you offered felt like comfort. Sometimes what a frightened creature needs is not the most advanced solution. Sometimes it is simply warmth and patience." Kalith did not respond immediately, but I could see something shifting behind her eyes, a mixture of relief and quiet astonishment. Word of what happened spread through the station faster than I ever expected. Within a day, crew members from a dozen different species were whispering about the human who had silenced the screaming prince when royal physicians from 6 systems had failed. I found myself the subject of curious glances in the corridors, hushed conversations that stopped the moment I walked past, and for the first time since boarding the ship, people actually looked at me instead of through me. 3 days later, I was summoned to the royal quarters again, this time not for an emergency, but for an audience with the Ilthar matriarch herself, a being whose age and authority commanded silence in any room she entered. Her name was Threnna, and she was easily the oldest and most respected member of the Ilthar aboard the station, her scales a deep, ancient shade of gold that seemed to absorb the light around her. I stood before her, uncertain of the proper protocol, but she simply studied me for a long moment before speaking. "You saved my grandson," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. "Our physicians, our scientists, our ancient records, all of them failed where you succeeded with nothing more than a simple offering and quiet words. I wish to understand why." I hesitated before answering honestly. "I do not think it was about medicine," I said. "I think your hatchling needed to feel safe before he could feel hungry. Everything offered to him was clinical, cold, designed for survival rather than comfort. Sometimes the smallest and youngest among us need warmth before they need anything else." Threnna considered this for a long moment, her ancient eyes studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away, though I forced myself to hold her gaze. "Humanity is considered young among the Confederation," she finally said. "Primitive, by some standards, still bound to organic food, still cooking meals rather than synthesizing them efficiently. And yet it seems this very trait, one many species view as backward, may be exactly what our advanced systems overlooked." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded, unsure whether I was being complimented or quietly mocked. Threnna reached toward a small pouch at her side and withdrew a carved token. its surface etched with symbols I did not recognize. She placed it gently into my hands, her claws surprisingly careful despite their size. "This is a symbol given only to those who protect something precious to our family," she said. "The closest translation your device will offer is likely imperfect, but it means something close to keeper of the small and frightened. It is not a title given lightly." I thanked her, still uncertain of the full weight of what had just happened, and left the royal quarters carrying a token, whose meaning I would not fully understand for weeks afterward. The following days brought changes I never expected. The young prince, whose name I eventually learned was Dravith, began following me through the sections of the station where I was permitted to walk, his small clawed feet clicking against the metal floors as he trailed a respectful distance behind me. His handlers watched nervously at first, but slowly grew accustomed to his fascination with the human who had ended his suffering. Diplomats who once ignored me during meetings began seeking me out, asking careful, curious questions about human approaches to care, comfort, and early development. Species who had barely acknowledged my presence for 6 months suddenly wanted to understand what humanity might contribute, beyond the technical and scientific fields most valued within the Confederation. It was during one of these conversations that I met Daniel Cole, a fellow human serving aboard a different Confederation vessel, who happened to be visiting Velkatha Station for supply exchange. He found me in the station's small dining hall, sitting alone as usual, though the stares from nearby tables felt different now, curious rather than dismissive. "I heard what happened," he said, sliding into the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation. "The whole station is talking about it. Human woman saves royal dragon prince with soup and kind words. Sounds like something out of an old story." I laughed despite myself. The first genuine laugh I had allowed myself in months. "It was not that dramatic," I said. "I just noticed something everyone else overlooked." Daniel studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than amused. "Maybe that is exactly what makes us valuable out here," he said. "Everyone else brings technology, calculations, efficiency. We bring something different. We notice the small things. We know how to comfort something that is scared, human or otherwise." I thought about his words long after our conversation ended, turning them over in my mind as I walked back toward my quarters that evening. It was true that humanity was often viewed as primitive within the wider Confederation, our reliance on organic food and traditional methods sometimes mocked by species who had long since moved beyond such simple practices. But perhaps that very simplicity carried a value none of them had considered, a value rooted not in advanced technology, but in something far older and far more universal. Weeks passed, and Dravith grew steadily stronger and more curious, his small form beginning to show signs of the powerful creature he would eventually become. He still sought me out whenever his handlers allowed it, chirping happily whenever he caught sight of me in the corridors, occasionally nudging at my hand in search of another warm meal. Kalith, once cautious and reserved, had become something close to a friend, often seeking me out to discuss human approaches to care that might benefit other young Ilthar across their territories. It was during one such conversation that Kalith revealed something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. "Did you know," she said one afternoon as we walked together through the station's observation deck, "that our species has struggled with hatchling mortality for centuries? Many young ones refuse sustenance during their earliest weeks, and our physicians have always assumed it to be a natural weakness within certain bloodlines. We never considered that the offerings themselves might be the problem." I looked out at the stars stretching endlessly beyond the observation window, considering her words carefully. "Maybe it was never about weakness," I said. "Maybe every young creature, no matter the species, needs warmth and comfort before anything else. Perhaps your ancestors simply never had anyone to show them a different approach." Kalith was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Threnna has requested that a formal proposal be sent to the Confederation Council," she finally said. "A proposal recommending human advisors work alongside Ilthar physicians in the care of royal hatchlings across our territories. Some among our people are hesitant, still viewing humanity as young and unrefined. But others, myself included, believe your species understands something ours has overlooked for generations." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply continued watching the stars, allowing myself a rare moment of quiet pride. In the months that followed, my role aboard Velkatha Station changed entirely. I was no longer simply a cultural liaison ignored by most of the crew. I became something closer to an advisor, consulted whenever questions arose about care, comfort, and the needs of the young across different species. Other humans aboard nearby vessels began receiving similar requests. Their simple, organic approaches to comfort, suddenly valued in ways none of us had expected when we first joined the Confederation. Dravith continued to grow, his scales darkening slowly into the deep colors of his lineage, his small clawed feet growing steadier with each passing week. He still sought me out whenever possible, still chirped happily at the scent of warm broth, and though I knew a day would eventually come when royal duties would separate us entirely, I found myself grateful for the strange bond that had formed between a human liaison and the future ruler of an ancient species. Sometimes late at night, walking the quiet corridors of the station, I thought about how strange the entire situation had been. A species considered young, unrefined, primitive by galactic standards, had solved a mystery that centuries of Ilthar science and tradition had failed to understand. Not through advanced technology, not through complicated calculations, but through something as simple as warmth, patience, and a bowl of soup made with a recipe passed down from a mother who never could have imagined her recipe would one day save the heir to an alien throne. Perhaps that was the true lesson hidden within everything that had happened. Advancement was not always measured in technology or efficiency. Sometimes the oldest, simplest truths carried a value that no amount of scientific progress could replace. Truths about comfort, about care, about recognizing fear in something small, and responding with patience rather than calculation. I still keep the token Threnna gave me, carved and worn smooth from months of carrying it in my pocket. Keeper of the small and frightened. It was a title I never expected to earn, given for an act I never expected to matter beyond a single quiet evening in a cold medical chamber. And yet it had changed everything, not just for Dravith, not just for the Ilthar, but for how an entire species now viewed the quiet, overlooked value of simple human kindness. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are not found through advanced science or complex calculation. Sometimes they are found in the simplest gestures, warm broth shared with a frightened creature, quiet words spoken with patience, and the willingness to sit beside something small and scared, until the fear finally begins to fade.